So she felt she could contribute to the war effort by instructing those people in Pearl Harbor to be pilots. So she went out to Pearl Harbor in September of '41, and she got a job with Ole Andrew Flying Service. Ole Andrew owned a flying service there, and Ole Andrew brought Cornelia on as one of his lead instructors. She was an interesting gal. She was tall, she was pretty, and she was smart. Now, two of those dimensions as a Nashville debutante are not really assets, that being tall and smart. So she never really clicked with that environment. She was much too much of a doer, not enough of a Nashville debutante kind of sit back and just look pretty kind of gal. So she quickly got her ratings accomplished, and so within a year and a half basically, she had her instructor license. So Cornelia, she was a dedicated flight instructor. So on December 7th, Sunday morning, she was out there very early instructing a student by the name of So Umala, who was on his pre-solo flight. So first thing in the morning, they're up airborne. 7:45, they're circling the airfield. They're over John Rogers Airfield getting ready to land. Cornelia looks out one side of the airplane and sees an airplane coming right at him. Her first thought is, those Army Air Corps guys are flying in the wrong airspace. So her first reaction is to kind of curse those Army Air Corps guys. So she grabs the plane, pulls the airplane up, barely gets missed by this pilot that never even saw her. And as it flashed underneath her, the first thing that she really sees is the rising sun on the top of the wing as it goes by. And she realizes now that this isn't an Army Air Corps airplane. This is the Imperial Japanese Navy bringing their aircraft in to attack Pearl Harbor. She looks towards the harbor. She sees the first bombs going off quite literally. So she takes the aircraft and continues to fly it. She turns to the runway as quickly as she can. While she's in the turn to the runway, she hears an airplane pass behind her. She never sees it, but she hears strafing. So she knows she's being shot at by these aircraft, but she never saw that one. She gets it on the ground as quick as she can, taxis up, shuts it down. They jump out. They start running across the tarmac back towards Andrew Flying Service, and they get strafed again by another Japanese Zero. In the first pass, she narrowly missed being collided with, and then two strafing runs. Somewhere in there, the airplane itself got hit, but she never got hit, nor did her student. They ran into the flight service and they yelled, "Hey, we're under attack by the Japanese." Everybody kind of laughed at him and said, "Hey, Cornelia, that's cute." One of the mechanics runs in just about 30 seconds later and yells, "We're under attack by the Japanese," and Bob Tice just got killed on the ramp because he was hit while he had done the same thing Cornelia did. He landed, started running across the tarmac, and was shot. So after the attack, she came back out to the airfield on Monday, saw holes in the aircraft from the bullets, kind of really impacted her as to, well, how close she had come to being a casualty of that day, like some of the other people that were flying and some of the other civilians that were flying. And so the military basically said there's no civilian flying on Hawaii anymore. So all of Ole Andrews' airplanes were pushed back into hangars and kind of just tucked away for the duration of the war. Didn't come back to life until 1945. So after the attack on Pearl Harbor, all civilian aviation was grounded in Hawaii and on the west coast of the United States. So now all of a sudden here's this flight instructor with a passionate love for flying, and she's grounded. So there's kind of, one, she isn't able to do what she loves to do, and two, there was a genuine fear of Japanese invasion of the island. So basically the goal for all the civilians and non-combatants and those people that weren't signing up to directly join the Navy from there or weren't a part of the military already was, it's time to head home. She got home and was at Nashville for a while, and obviously everybody was interested in this story of this young woman who was one of the first to meet the Japanese, one of the people to see the first bombs going off while she was in the air. She was always looking for a flying job, and she finally heard about the Women's Auxiliary Ferry Service starting up, and she was literally the second person to join the WAFs and started flying PT-19s and doing deliveries of PT-19 out of Dover. So that was her first job in the military. She was very excited, very proud to be a part of that, and she did that for quite a while. Eventually, she was essentially promoted to BT-13s, and she moved out to Long Beach, California, and she was flying BT-13s and delivering those out of Long Beach, California. until she was killed in an in-flight accident. So what happened was they did some formation flying and they said, well, okay, that was awesome. They started drifting apart, said, we're done. And then they start checking fuel and you're looking down like this and you're not really looking outside, and then you start that drift towards each other and you don't really see it in your peripheral vision. Next thing you know, you look up and you have this closure rate on the other aircraft. She saw that, tried to push away from the other airplane, but she ended up hitting the top of her airplane, breaking her left wing significantly, and hitting sort of the bottom of the other airplane, although not damaging landing gear or anything like that. And she ended up very violently spinning into the desert right below them. She crashed into the ground. The other fella managed to live with that damaged airplane and get on to the next airport. So when she got to Hawaii, when Cornelia Fort got to Hawaii, she started flying with Andrew Flying Service, and she was flying all of their airplanes, and there were several cadets there and several other aircraft, and her logbooks reflect several different types of aircraft. Her logbook only reflects one registration number of interstate cadets. So it was a little confusing initially when we bought this airplane that, you know, her logbook would say something completely different. Logbook being primary data, you kind of looked at that primary data and go, well, this is the facts. The bigger problem was this airplane, 37266, lived on Hawaii for many years afterwards, flew in Hawaii for many years afterwards, all the way through the 1970s. And all that time, this airplane was known as the airplane that Cornelia Fort was flying the day that the Pearl Harbor was attacked. So it became this question of reconciling a verbal legend on Hawaii of this was the airplane Cornelia Fort was flying. It had that sort of connection to the provenance of always having been there, and reconciling that to a logbook that said something completely different. So this aircraft came back to the United States somewhere in the 1980s time frame, was owned by a couple of owners, and then was owned by one particular owner at the end, George Mothershed, and I believe that while he owned this aircraft, he passed away. And it kind of came into a estate sale situation where the family didn't really know the story behind this airplane. It was a passion of his, but it was one of those things that kind of fell by the wayside in that transition and that, you know, terrible time of his passing. And so this airplane kind of became a bit of a liability, and so I think that's how it ended up in a scrap heap. So the family kind of said, well, we can't really repair this airplane, it's not really worth anything, so we'll just sell it to the scrap guy. So it ends up in a scrap pile. And the guy that bought it had basically 3 airplanes and a bunch of other airplanes parts. He was building a business along that line, but it was time for him. He had decided he was going to retire, so he had literally 3 airframes of interstate cadets and a whole bunch of parts. So he called the most prolific interstate cadet flyer out there, and that's Kent Peach. So Kent Peach talks to the guy and finally says, sure, I'll buy all your parts. And the guy did suggest that there might have been something about the Pearl Harbor airplane in this pile of parts. So Kent was particularly interested. He goes down and he picks through the pile of parts, and lo and behold, he picks up one of the airframes, and it's aircraft 109. To validate that, he talked to another expert on the interstate cadets, and that's Tim Talon. Tim kind of knows the interstate cadet. It's his favorite airplane. He's rebuilt many of them, and he knows them very well. And so when Kent called and talked to Tim, Tim agreed that this was the interstate cadet that the Cornelia Fort was flying during the attack on Pearl Harbor. So they had it restored. Tim Talon did the restoration, did a beautiful job, just every little detail, like these little pins that holding the engine cowling shut. These things are a pain in the neck, but they're authentic. So Kent got to a place where he was looking to downsize his operations and start selling some of the interstates that he had in his collection so he could start restoring other aircraft. He didn't want to get rid of this, but he also couldn't really keep it. So he and I were literally talking in the ICAS bar and the ICAS convention in 2012, and he was telling me these stories about how he has about this airplane. I really respected that particular airframe because he had told about the year before he had done the 70th anniversary recreation, and just not many people showed up. So he was a little frustrated with that. And I kind of said, well, I think it's because of this disconnect in the history and the provenance. I bought it from Kent, and I basically, the deal was, I'll buy it from you at just basic, really nice interstate cadet prices. And if it turns out to be the Pearl, then we'll work together. And if it doesn't, then I just own an airplane. So I kind of bought it on the basis that it's just a regular old interstate cadet, very beautifully restored interstate cadet. but just an interstate cadet. So we did the research. Eventually we figured out that there was a flaw in the logbook, and we kind of proved that this, beyond a reasonable doubt, is the airplane that was flying over Hawaii. So on my initial research into the Pearl Harbor story, I was kind of surprised. I found out that there were really 8 general aviation aircraft, civilian pilots, flying that morning in the air. I, somewhere along the line, acquired the concept that there was only one airplane flying. I think quite literally from the Tora 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 movie. And so it built in my brain that there was this sort of one airplane flying and that was it. Well, there were 8 flying. There were Marguerite Gambo and Cornelia Fort. There were 2 women flying. Several of the people that were flying were killed. And so in buying the airplane, I decided, it kind of struck me that there's an important story to be told here. And that's the story of those other 7 airplanes that were airborne. Everybody knows there was one because they saw the movie. But those other 7 airplanes, I think, were lost to history. So I started a little LLC to help, put a little legal shell around telling the story, and I called that LLC the Lost Aviators of Pearl Harbor. And so Lost Aviators of Pearl Harbor is all about telling all the stories of those general aviation pilots that took off on a lovely Sunday morning just to have a nice flight in the air and enjoy their time airborne. And all of a sudden they took off civilians, all of a sudden they're landing combat veterans, or they were killed in combat. They were the first to be killed in combat. Bob Tice is the first recorded kill of Pearl Harbor. And he was the guy that was shot on the ground when after Cornelia had run in, he was the guy that was running out of his airplane and was shot on the ground. There were 2 Cubs that were out over the water, just off Oahu. Both of them were shot down and never seen again except for 1 foot, literally washed up on shore. So there's some fascinating stories behind these other 7 airplanes, and we're just trying to use this one aircraft as the fulcrum for telling the broader story of general aviation that was caught in the middle of a war zone.